Welcome to World History. Today we're going to start by talking about the idea of human civilization. It's important to understand that for the vast majority of human history, humans existed as hunters and gatherers, in which they lived in small communities, usually with family members. They obviously hunted. They obviously hunted large animals and often trapped smaller animals, and gathered resources where they could find. During this period in human history, the food that was provided by the environment most strongly limited human populations, and human groups were usually rather small, with their decisions being based on where they could find their next meal. Obviously, there are some pretty strong drawbacks to this whole situation because, of course, the food supply could be potentially uncertain. And so, over time, human beings began to band together and exert more control over their environment. Obviously, because humans had very little control over the food supply, humans gradually, as the populations grew, spread out. And as we can see, to the best of our knowledge, early humans started in Africa and then slowly, over a period of hundreds of thousands of years, migrated to the other continents, settling in these places and sort of adjusting their lifestyle to conform to the types of food that was available. So migration was an important part of the early human experience. And the places that people started settling were these sort of fertile river valleys. River valleys, of course, have a variety of reasons that make them, or a variety of factors that make them ideal for settlement. Easy access to water and transportation is, of course, very important. Also, river valleys tend to flood, and when they flood, they often replenish the soil, which allows people to farm in one place more often. So humans settled in a variety of different river valleys, and as more and more people settled in these places and began to both plant crops and also to raise animals, the human populations began to grow, which meant that human civilizations had to become more complex to deal with the problems associated with lots of people living together in one place. And so, because of these advantages, what we started to see was humans settling down in very specific places. These are generally called the civilizational hearths, or the places in which large scale human society developed. As you can see, there are four main ones, all being settled right around 5,000 years ago. Egypt, of course, you're hopefully familiar with. Mesopotamia, right here in modern day Iraq, in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Indus River Valley Civilization in South Asia, and the Yellow River in what is today northern China. So, all of these places, humans started settling in large numbers, and of course, this necessitated much larger and more complex societies. Of course, the settlement of these places led to developing more complicated farming techniques and allowed people to grow more complicated crops. And slowly, these crops would spread to other places. And these sort of agricultural areas would then export their crops to other places, which would lead to more complicated civilizations there. So, of course, once technology was developed, it started to spread to other places, which allowed more complicated societies to form there. Eventually, human societies started to develop into even more complicated structures. This is the birth of what today we call empires. An empire, in general, has a much larger economy and a stronger government with bureaucracies and militaries. Militaries, obviously, is important for defending the empire, whereas a bureaucracy is the parts of government that make the empire function. They begin then to produce more complicated goods, to expect more out of their people, and from there the population grows. They often also start incorporating larger areas in, which of course, the larger an empire grows, the more complicated it needs to be in order to continue to function. Probably the first ancient empire was the Egyptian Empire, which you hopefully learned about in sixth grade. The Egyptian civilization began along the Nile River Valley, which is a very sort of slow flowing, very predictable river. Of course, as you know, the Egyptians built massive works, including pyramids, which they used to bury their dead, and other important religious sites like the Sphinx. What we get from ancient Egypt is, of course, a lot of very complicated crafts that show a lot of skill with stonework. Here we see some carving reliefs from an Egyptian temple. We get a system of writing that you might be familiar with. These are the hieroglyphics, which we can now translate, and they create a system of writing in which the Egyptians could record things that they thought were important. And of course, we get artwork and religious customs. You can clearly see the hieroglyphics here and the process of mummifying the dead, which allowed Egyptians to enter the afterlife in their beliefs by preserving portions of their body. So we know a lot about Egyptian sort of religious and cultural customs because, of course, we still have their writings. One of the more interesting stories about Egypt that helps reflect sort of the stability of Egyptian society is Egyptian scientists had were so had studied the Nile so carefully that they knew exactly the day in which the Nile River would start to flood. And so one of the Egyptian leader, the pharaoh's official duties, was to walk out on his balcony and order the Nile to start flooding, which of course then the Nile would. When it was time for the Nile River to recede, he would walk out again on his balcony and order the Nile River to recede, and the floodwaters would go down. Obviously, the pharaoh didn't actually have the power to command the river to flood, but Egyptian scientists had calculated when the river would flood, and the pharaoh used this knowledge as a way to help support his and legitimize his power. Mesopotamia was quite a different animal than Egypt. Mesopotamia was Mesopotamian society developed along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, as we can see here. And there was a series of different kingdoms that came in Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates tended to be much more uh, dangerous than the Nile River. They often flooded irregularly and would change course, which led to a lot of instability. And so, generally, when things go poorly, empires are overthrown or collapse, and then new empires replace them. What we do know about most Mesopotamian societies is they had a system of writing known as cuneiform that allowed them to record important business transactions, religious rituals, things like that. And they had an important canon of literature and myth, including perhaps the oldest story ever written, Gilgamesh, which is the story of an ancient king who ends up befriending a wild man and from the mountains and pause, including the story of Gilgamesh. Pause. Mesopotamia also gives us some of the earliest literature in the world, including the story of Gilgamesh, which is a story of an ancient king of Mesopotamia that gives us information about the way that some Mesopotamians lived and the things that they valued. And it's the story of Gilgamesh triumphing over forces of nature and the gods, showing the mastery of the Mesopotamians over their environment. Mesopotamian societies tended to be extremely bloody. Specifically, the Assyrian Empire was very warlike and bloody, and so some of the histories that they wrote show us this sort of this. Mesopotamian societies tended to be very warlike and bloody, and so their stories and their history focused on this violence. And so here we have a story of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal II and some of his conquests. Pause so you can read this. Obviously incredibly incredibly violent, significant, a lot of mutilation in here, and showing the heads of conquered enemies clearly demonstrates a desire to impress others with your power. And so by reading the stories that the Mesopotamians tell about themselves, we get a sense of what their society was like, which you're going to investigate more in today's reading. So, ancient humans, uh, ancient humans joined together in these civilizations, and a lot of times these civilizations sort of shaped themselves to the areas in which they settled.